Welcome to the deep dive. You sent in some articles on Pakistan's economic situation and this latest IMF bailout deal. It seems like things are really intense over there. I mean, we've got $7 billion on the line, accusations of sabotage, and we're talking about a nuclear-armed nation potentially on the verge of default.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how intertwined the economics and geopolitics are here. And we're not just looking at numbers, we're looking at the balance of power, international relations, and how this will impact the lives of 241 million people.
You provided some really interesting sources that highlight just how much of a roller coaster Pakistan's economy has been over the years. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Pakistan and the IMF have a long history together. They've received 25 bailout packages since 1958.
25. That's a pretty big number. What does that say about their economic stability?
It points to a pattern of instability, I'd say, and this reliance on external support to keep things afloat. It makes you wonder how effective these repeated bailouts are in addressing the root causes of their economic problems.
Right. And the sources also talk about how political instability often makes the economic crises even worse.
Absolutely. Take Imran Khan's decision to reduce fuel prices right before being ousted. For example, populist moves like that might offer temporary relief, but in the long run, they can have negative consequences.
It's interesting how these kinds of political decisions can have such a huge impact on the economy. And speaking of big impacts, Pakistan's economy seems to be constantly going up and down. Record inflation 1 minute, then it drops, foreign reserves dwindle, then they get a boost. It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, the volatility is definitely striking. In May 2023, inflation hit a record 38%, but then by October, it had fallen to 9.6%. And then foreign reserves got a boost from deposits from China, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, bringing them up to $9 billion. But even with that, it's still a risky situation.
So now we're here again with the IMS potentially offering a $7 billion bailout. But it sounds like there are some pretty big challenges this time around.
There are two main issues that are holding things up. First, Pakistan has to get rollovers for their debt repayments from China, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia.
That makes sense, especially since they're facing a potential default. But why is that such a problem?
Well, China holds almost 30% of Pakistan's $130 billion external debt. That gives them a lot of influence in these talks.
Wow, that's a significant portion of the debt. And what's the other obstacle?
Pakistan needs to find another $2 billion in financing. They've been trying to get it from commercial banks in the Middle East, but so far it hasn't been successful.
So they need to convince their current lenders to give them more time and then also find new lenders willing to contribute. That seems pretty tough given their current situation.
It definitely is. And that's where things get even more complicated. Pakistan's finance minister, Ishaq Dar, has publicly accused the IMF of intentionally delaying the release of funds. He even suggested that there might be sabotage going on.
He even said that there's geopolitics at play, hinting that someone's trying to force Pakistan into default. His statements were really strong, even bringing up Pakistan's nuclear status. Do you think there's any truth to these accusations? Is the IMF really trying to undermine Pakistan?
Well, it's important to understand the IMF's typical approach. They're known for being strict about financial discipline, and they're usually not in favor of subsidies. Often their conditions include raising energy prices and cutting government spending, which could be pretty unpopular politically, especially in a country like Pakistan.
That's true. So those conditions, while maybe beneficial in the long run, could add even more pressure to the situation.
Right. And to really understand Dar's accusations, we have to look at the geopolitical context. Pakistan has strong ties with China, which some see as a rivalry with the West.
Historically, Pakistan also got a lot of support from the U.S., particularly during the war in Afghanistan, but those dynamics are definitely changing, right?
They are, and Pakistan's relationship with China could definitely complicate these IMF negotiations.
So it's not as simple as just good guy versus bad guy. It's more nuanced than that.
For sure. We have to consider both Pakistan's internal economic factors and the external pressures they're facing. This isn't just about economics. It's about managing a very delicate balance of power on a global scale.
This is where things get really interesting. What could happen if this IMF deal doesn't go through? What if Pakistan can't get the bailout?
Well, the consequences could be really bad. A default would seriously damage Pakistan's credibility in the international financial markets, which would make it extremely hard to get loans in the future. It could even lead to their economy collapsing.
And what about the people in Pakistan? How would this affect their daily lives?
A default would likely cause a sharp devaluation of the currency. That means hyperinflation and prices for basic goods would skyrocket.
So even though inflation has come down recently, it could easily spiral out of control again.
Exactly. People's savings would be wiped out, their buying power would plummet, and poverty rates would probably surge. It would be devastating.
It sounds like the stakes are incredibly high. What if they do manage to get the deal, though? What happens then?
If they meet the IMF's conditions and get that $7 billion loan, it would give them some much-needed breathing room.
They could stabilize foreign reserves, take care of immediate debt payments, and hopefully avoid a default. But we've talked about the conditions that come with IMF loans.
Yes, those conditions are a crucial part of the equation. They would have to make those tough reforms we mentioned, like cutting subsidies and raising taxes.
And that's not always easy in a country with a history of political instability.
You're absolutely right. Even if they get the money, it's not a guaranteed happy ending. It's just the start of a long and difficult path to recovery. And at best, the IMF program is just a short-term solution.
So what would a long-term solution look like?
In the long term, Pakistan needs to address the structural issues in their economy. They have a chronic trade deficit and low tax revenue. And most importantly, they need to break free from this cycle of depending on foreign loans.
That makes sense. But how do they actually do that? Where do they even begin?
One solution that's being talked about is debt restructuring.
Debt restructuring. What does that actually involve?
Basically, it's a negotiation between Pakistan and its creditors, China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to make their debt more manageable.
So they could ask for longer repayment periods, lower interest rates, or even for some of the debt to be forgiven. That sounds really complicated.
It definitely is. It takes a lot of skill, and everyone involved needs to be willing to compromise. It's a long shot, but this strategy has worked for other countries in the past.
So it's a possible way forward, but not a guaranteed solution. And the IMF bailout is really just a temporary fix. It seems like Pakistan is stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They are. And the decisions they make in the coming months will have consequences not just within Pakistan, but potentially across the region and even further. It's a fascinating and also concerning situation to watch unfold.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. We'll be back after a short break to explore some of the potential consequences of Pakistan's economic crisis and dig deeper into these potential solutions. We've been talking about the economics of this whole situation, but what about the human cost of this crisis?
Yeah, that's really important. This goes beyond, balance sheets and debt figures. We're talking about 241 million people whose lives are being directly impacted by all of this.
You mentioned the possibility of social unrest if things get even worse. What could that actually look like?
Well, imagine food and fuel becoming scarce and prices going through the roof, people losing their jobs, savings disappearing, and then they can't afford basic necessities. That kind of widespread economic hardship can easily lead to desperation and anger.
It's definitely a recipe for instability. I mean, we've seen protests and riots erupt pretty quickly in other countries going through similar economic pressures.
Exactly. And Pakistan already has its own political instability, so this kind of economic crisis could just make those tensions worse and create a really volatile situation.
It just shows how closely connected economics and social stability are. And you mentioned before that Pakistan being a nuclear power adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
Absolutely. A destabilized Pakistan dealing with a potential economic collapse and social unrest has serious security implications, not just for the region, but for the whole world.
So this isn't just an economic crisis, it could become a security crisis as well, which is probably why the international community, including the IMF, is so invested in helping Pakistan find a way through this.
Exactly. But as we've discussed, IMF help often comes with conditions, and those conditions can be pretty tough.
Some people argue that those conditions, while meant to help, can actually make things worse in the short term, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable. How do you see that playing out in Pakistan?
It's a balancing act. The IMF wants to make sure its loans are used responsibly, and that countries implement reforms to help them grow sustainably. But austerity measures like cutting subsidies and raising taxes can hit low-income households the hardest.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. They need to fix the economic problems, but they also don't want to push people deeper into poverty in the process. That's a tough position for any government.
It really is. It highlights the need for a more nuanced approach, one that promotes financial responsibility while also protecting the most vulnerable.
You mentioned debt restructuring as a potential long-term solution. What would that look like in practice?
So debt restructuring is basically a negotiation between the country in debt, in this case Pakistan, and the creditors.
So Pakistan would sit down with China, the UAEs, and Saudi Arabia and try to renegotiate the terms of their phones.
Exactly. The goal would be to reach an agreement that makes the debt more manageable for Pakistan.
So they might negotiate longer repayment periods, lower interest rates, or even ask for some of the debt to be forgiven.
All of those are options, but the specifics would really depend on how willing the creditors are to cooperate and what comes out of those negotiations.
But why would creditors agree to restructure the debt? Wouldn't they rather get all of their money back on the original schedule?
Well, sometimes it's actually in their best interest to restructure. If a country is on the verge of default, like Pakistan is, they might not be able to pay anything back at all.
So it's better to get something back even if it's less than what they were originally owed rather than risk getting nothing.
right? And Pakistan's strategic importance, along with its relationship with major players like China, might make creditors more open to negotiation. They don't want to see Pakistan completely collapse.
But even if everyone agrees to talk, debt restructuring is still a very complex process, right?
Absolutely, it requires careful planning, skilled negotiators, and a willingness to compromise from everyone involved. And even if the negotiations are successful, it's not a magic solution.
So it's not a quick fix, but it could give them some time to get their economy back on track.
Yeah, you could say the debt restructuring can buy a country time to put those necessary reforms into action.
So even with a restructured debt, Pakistan still has to deal with those fundamental economic problems we discussed.
Exactly. Debt restructuring doesn't fix things like the trade deficit, low tax revenue, and the reliance on imports. It just creates a better environment for those reforms to actually work.
Okay, so we've looked at the economic side of this and explored some potential solutions, but we can't forget that there are real people at the heart of this crisis. How are their lives being affected beyond the economic hardships we've already talked about?
The uncertainty and instability are having a huge impact on people's mental health. People are anxious about their future, their jobs, their families. It's a constant state of worry and fear.
I can imagine the rising cost of living is forcing families to make some really difficult decisions.
You're right. People are having to cut back on essential things, reduce how much food they're eating, even taking their children out of school because they can no longer afford the fees.
It's hard to hear about the sacrifices people are having to make just to get by, and education is so important, especially in a country like Pakistan. This could have long-lasting effects on the country's future.
Definitely, when families are struggling to put food on the table, education often becomes a luxury they just can't afford.
So this economic crisis is impacting every part of Pakistani society, from healthcare and education to the overall well-being of its citizens.
It really shows that economic crises aren't just about numbers. They have a real human cost.
We've painted a pretty bleak picture so far. Is there any reason to be optimistic? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, there's always hope. The fact that Pakistan is working with the IMF and exploring things like debt restructuring shows that they're willing to find a way out of this.
And the Pakistani people are known for their resilience. They've faced a lot of challenges throughout their history, and they've always managed to come back from them.
That's true. Their resilience and determination will be crucial in getting through this tough period.
So while things are serious, it's not a hopeless situation.
Not at all. It's complex and challenging, but not impossible. With the right policy support from the international community and the strength of the Pakistani people, there's still a chance for a better future.
We've covered a lot today, and you've given us some really great insights. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked a lot about the IMF's role in this crisis, both as a potential solution and as someone setting some tough conditions. It makes you think about the power dynamics here. How much influence should these international financial institutions have, especially when it comes to developing nations?
That's a big question, right? Do these institutions like the IMF act as neutral forces for economic stability, or are they maybe even unintentionally keeping developing countries reliant on outside help?
And what about the conditions they impose? Are those always the best way to achieve sustainable growth, or do they sometimes make existing inequalities worse?
Those are tough questions with no easy answers. But they're important ones to think about as we try to understand what shapes our world and how it all impacts individual lives.
And this isn't just about Pakistan, right? These questions apply on a global scale.
Exactly. This situation shows how interconnected our world is, and how economic policies in one place can have ripple effects everywhere. What happens in Pakistan could affect other countries facing similar problems.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key things our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the main takeaway is that economic crises are rarely just about economics. They're tied up with politics, social dynamics, and global power structures.
And we've definitely seen that in Pakistan's case.
For sure, and it reminds us that we need to look beyond the numbers and headlines to see the human stories at the heart of these crises.
It also reminds us that there are rarely simple solutions.
You're right, these situations need a multifaceted approach. We have to think about both short-term relief and long-term strategies for sustainable growth. And it's so important to involve the people who are actually affected when creating those solutions.
What are some things our listeners should pay attention to as this story develops?
Well, first, will Pakistan actually secure that $7 billion IMF deal? Will they meet those conditions, and will it be enough to prevent a default?
And what about beyond that immediate hurdle?
It's important to see if Pakistan takes steps to address those underlying economic issues we discussed. Can they reduce their reliance on imports, increase their tax revenue, and create a more stable economic base?
And on the geopolitical side of things?
Keep an eye on how Pakistan manages its relationships with China, the U.S., and other key players. Those relationships will definitely shape their economic future.
This has been a really insightful discussion. Thank you for helping us understand this complex and fascinating issue.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy diving into these nuanced topics and exploring the connections that aren't always obvious.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep asking questions and learning about these important global issues. Until next time, keep diving deep.